It's one of those artifacts of the electronic age, videotape of an ordinary afternoon that, in a matter of seconds, became etched forever in our memories. But what many of us have forgotten, or maybe never really knew, is what a close call it was. We nearly lost the president that
Absolutely.
day.
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that it was close.
Retired Secret Service agent Jerry Parr knows these pictures from the inside. That's him pushing Reagan into the limousine.
He always told me one time, he said, "You treated me just like a baseball thrown into the car." As we pulled away, I could see the bullet hole in the window and 3 bodies on the sidewalk. I knew then that it had been gunfire.
In a profound twist of fate, Monday, March 30th, 1981, was a day that Jerry Parr wasn't even scheduled to guard Reagan. As the head of the protective detail, Parr hadn't yet become familiar with the new president and simply wanted to study his habits.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
A routine day was on the agenda. A few White House meetings and a speech at the Washington Hilton Ballroom. But that routine was shattered at 2:27 p.m. when 6 shots rang out.
The first shot, the first thing that you see, the first yell, the first scream, the first violence, you go into action.
You were operating on more than
well, it wasn't
training, it was instinct too.
Yeah, instinct, intuition, a combination of both maybe, and all the training and all the facts. I wasn't afraid of him to handle his body like that. In other words, I think when you're a young agent, you're reluctant to do anything. You're touch them, grab them, or do something with them. But I wasn't, and so it just happened to be that day for me. I hoped it had never come because of what happened with Kennedy.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark.
The 1963 assassination of John F. Kennedy was still fresh in the minds of the Secret Service, and in its wake there had been a string of violence. The shootings of Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, Governor George Wallace, and 2 assassination attempts on Gerald Ford. 2 decades of gunfire that had taught the Secret Service one lesson above all: move fast.
If Jerry Parr was a split second slower, he would have gotten it in the head. If you looked at the angle that he was going at, it would have hit Reagan in the head. At this moment,
Washington Post reporter Del Quinton Wilbur has written a new book that discloses heretofore unknown details of that day. It takes its title from Reagan's Secret Service code name, Rawhide.
Rawhide is okay. Follow up. Rawhide is okay.
Wilbur petitioned the Secret Service to release these audio recordings of radio calls from the president's limo.
You want to go to the hospital or back to the White House? We're going to Crown.
you hear it, they're so calm. And I think that's the training, the discipline that the Secret Service put into those guys.
From the first shot, the door being shut is about 3 or 4 seconds. And then in about 6 or 7 seconds, we've started moving. Because I told the driver, move out.
As the armored vehicle raced across Washington, Agent Jerry Parr's mind was racing too. Could this have been a so-called decapitation strike by the Soviets? Were other gunmen still waiting in ambush? Although the shooter, 25-year-old John Hinckley Jr., was in custody, not until late that evening were authorities certain that Hinckley had acted alone. Back at the Hilton, Press Secretary Jim Brady was gravely wounded, as were Secret Service agent Tim McCarthy and police officer Thomas Delahanty. At that point, no one knew the president had also been shot.
So my job then was to see if he'd really been hit. And so what I did then, I ran my hands up under his coat, around his belt line, and I started working up in the armpit area, up in the back of his neck, through his hair and everything. And I didn't see any blood at all. But about DuPont Circle, or maybe just under DuPont Circle, he started spitting up this blood, profuse amounts of red, bright red, frothy blood. And I thought, well, what would have caused that? Maybe landing on top of him cracked a rib. Maybe it punctured a lung.
That was when Parr made the single most important decision of the day.
Roger, we want to go to the emergency room, George Washington.
Forget the White House, get to a hospital. By chance, the closest hospital was on the campus of George Washington University, a hospital that had a dedicated team of trauma doctors and nurses standing by, something few other hospitals had in those days.
When I walked down the emergency room after being stat paged to go down there, I had no clue why they wanted me. And I saw all these strange people around, you know, with the earplugs in and everything like that. And I said, what are these people all doing here? I walked in and there he was on the gurney, stark naked.
5 years earlier, when Dr. Joe Giordano had taken over trauma care at George Washington, its importance was only beginning to be appreciated.
The surgeons were returning from Vietnam. And the first thing they noticed was that, gee, in the field, they had everything they needed for resuscitation of a trauma patient, and the patients did very, very well. They came back to the United States, and it was a disaster. Emergency rooms did not have experienced personnel seeing patients.
Giordano believes the decision to bring Reagan straight to a modern trauma facility made all the difference.
And we knew he lost about 40–50% of his blood volume with a minimal blood pressure. He was 70 years old. I think that would have been a very critical issue if he had not gone directly to GW.
Back at the White House, uncertainty was the enemy. Secretary of State Al Haig famously created confusion about who was running the country.
As of now, I am in control here in the White House.
Reagan's top advisors had by then gathered at the hospital, eager to retake control of the situation. And as doctors began treating the president, not only did his vital signs bounce back, so did his sense of humor.
When we took him to the operating room, he looked up at me and he said, I hope you all are Republicans. And I said, today we're all Republicans, Mr. President.
Presidential aide Lynn Nofziger lost no time sharing Reagan's joke with the rest of the world.
He said to the doctors in the operating room, I hope you're all Republicans.
In a way, this event formed a bond with the American public.
Author Del Quentin Wilbur.
After the shooting, people saw him as a person. He was a guy who laughed at death, right? He cracked jokes. American people like that. They like a guy who can do that. And it enabled him to separate the person from his policies and politics.
The combination of skillful message control and Reagan's rapid medical recovery was a game changer for his presidency.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
Appearing only a month later before a joint session of Congress, it was clear Ronald Reagan was back on track.
You wouldn't want to talk me into an encore, would you?
He got a lot of benefit down the road. Iran-Contra, the other controversies may have sunk another presidency, but they didn't sink his, and I'm convinced it's because the people of America got a rare glimpse at someone without the facade on. Remember, he had the most scripted presidency, and this was its most unscripted day.
An awful day to be sure, but one that came to define the legacy of Ronald Reagan.